Good morning. Exodus chapter 13 is where we're going to start at today, and we're going to start in verse 17 as we now move away from Egypt. We finished up last week with the 10th and final plague of the death of the firstborn of each of the families and of the livestock as well. And Pharaoh has finally relinquished his control over the Egyptians. As a matter of fact, the Israelites, As a matter of fact, the Egyptians are begging them to get out of town, handing them things to get them to go. Some of them are going with them as well, and they are going to leave Egypt. And as we're going to see today, God is going to lead Israel with wisdom, with purpose, and a few other things as we're kind of moving now out of Egypt and into, of course, the wilderness eventually, across the Red Sea, and some of the other kind of amazing things that are going to happen over the course of the next couple of chapters and over the next couple of weeks for us as well. Hopefully soon you'll be back in here with us. Looking forward to getting you all back in with us here on Sunday morning. Before we get started, though, let's open up with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for the opportunity, Lord, that we have to be able to still have our services, Lord, albeit in a different location and in a little different way of doing things, but still able to open up your word this morning and take a look at the lessons and truths that you have for us, Lord. So we thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity, Lord, to be able to do that, and the things you have blessed us with here at the church, to be able to make sure we're still reaching the body of believers, Lord, who have so faithfully come and have so faithfully tuned in each week as well, to continue to have church, Lord, in the way that we've had to have had it. And we pray soon this is all over and past, and fellowship again with each other. It tells us in Hebrews, where two or three are gathered, you're in the midst of it. And also, Lord, we know that in the book of Genesis, Lord, you said it's not good for us to be alone, Lord. It's good for us to be communicating and to be sociable, Lord, and fellowshipping with each other, Lord. So we pray soon that we'll be back here, Lord. We're looking forward to that day as well. I think of the requests that people have that it would have had that they're dealing with from concerns with getting sick to already being sick to having to go to the doctor and surgeries and all those different things, Lord. Pray for each one of those. For those whose livelihoods have been shaken and altered because of the shutdown and the quarantine and all this stuff that's happening, pray those just continue to be with them, admonish them, Lord. Continue to give them peace, continue to provide for them as well. For those unsaved loved ones, Lord, that we have that are don't know you, Lord, we pray, Lord, that they'll see the importance of a relationship with you and having that relationship as well, Lord. So, Lord, as we take a few moments this morning and look into the book of Exodus, we pray, Lord, you just continue to teach us from your word, or call to memory things forgotten. Open up new lessons to us and to our eyes, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen. If I had you here today, what we probably would have done is I would have brought in some little army men, little green plastic army men. I'm sure we all know what they are. And I would have given you one plastic army man per person, okay? And then you would have had to have given me ways or devise a plan or come up with ways to defeat the army man, right? The individual one. Different ways, maybe even had you probably demonstrate how you would defeat the tiny soldier who was going to give you this challenge. Now, if I took several of those army men back and put them in a tub and poured water over top of them to defeat them, it would have seemed obviously pretty easy, right? Floated around there, we could know what we wanted to them. It would have been pretty simple. But I guess you can kind of see the object lesson there, right? God looked down on that, to him, tiny army of Egypt and defeated them with even more ease than us putting those plastic army men into a clear tub and dumping water on top of them. That is the kind of God here that Israel gets to follow, right? That's the privilege they get to follow, that type of God. And we'll see that today. Now, the Battle of Yellow Ford may not know what that is, but in 1598, the real Battle of Yellow Ford took place. And what that was were Irish defenders under Hugh O'Neill. What they did is that they ambushed and defeated an English force of over 4,000. Okay, now this battle put Ireland out of the control of the English for quite some time. It also escalated into a war between Ireland and England, which then led to the Irish Rebellion. England considered the battle a military disaster since its troops were in much greater force than the Irish troops. Didn't expect even for a second to have any problems with this little excursion to them against the Irish Rebellion. But they lost. A couple other famous armies that lost that probably maybe shouldn't have lost. Of course, the Battle at Waterloo. That would have been Napoleon's disaster against the Anglo-Prussian forces. Little Bighorn, which we know that one. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's last stand, his disastrous battle there against Native Americans. Same type of disaster, just on a greater scale, to take place today. The king of Egypt, who up to this point could have attacked and conquered anybody at any time, decides to wage war against the Israelites, and therefore waging war against God. And of course, as we're going to see, it didn't work out very well for him at all. Verses 17 down through verse 22, we see God leading Israel here, first of all, leading Israel with wisdom. Now, we have been looking at the different I ams throughout this. I am the Redeemer, I am the Promise Keeper. This one we're going to be looking at, I am the leader, right? Because God now is officially taking the reins here and leading them out of Egypt. So the verses 17 down through verse 22, we see God leading Israel, and of course we see him leading them with wisdom. That's what God is. And it came to pass, verse 17, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war and they return to Egypt. So let's just stop there for a second. Verse 17, what was the very first people are leaving Egypt? The first wise decision here God makes in leading the children of Israel was what? He didn't take them into the land of the Philistines. And what was the reasoning? Right? He was afraid that the Philistines would try to attack him, and then the people think, oh no, God's led us into this, and they go run right back to Egypt. So we see the Israelites at this point, they were not ready for war. Now they're going to get ready for war, as we obviously know much later on, as they begin to conquer the Promised Land. But at this point, they're in no shape or form ready for war at all. And so God leads them away from the land of the Philistines because I'm sure the Philistines rose up against them. A lot of those people are going to defect back to Egypt. So we see a wise decision there, or something, God leading them with wisdom very early on. Verse 18, but God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed out of the land of Egypt. So God again knew the enemy would be a problem for them. So a prospect of having to fight a pretty aggressive foe like the Philistines would have made living in Egypt a more attractive idea. So God wisely leads them around the wilderness to the way of the Red Sea. Now it seems here as if God is being extra careful, right? Not to frighten the Israelites into returning to Egypt. But God wasn't trying to avoid leading his people into the path of the enemy. Instead, what he's doing is God wants to put the Israelites in a position where running was not an option. Right? He wanted to put them in a position where running is not an option when they did face an enemy. Of course, God knows that the Egyptians are coming back in a second. So he wants to put them in a position where there was nowhere for them to go, essentially. And this becomes apparent here as they reach their destination. And from a purely human perspective, a very, very unlikely place to camp. If you look over at verse 2 of chapter 14, speak unto the children of Israel that they turn and encamp before Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea over, against Baal-zephon, before it shall encamp by the sea. So from a purely human perspective, this was a very, very unlikely place to set up camp. Just the location, the region, it just would not, if we're going camping, if Pastor Rob and I are deciding to go out into this area and set up camp for a couple weeks and fish and do whatever, this is not the place we want to pick or be at all. But this is where God had put them and placed them there, as we're going to see, for a very, very specific reason. Verse 19, back over in chapter 13 now. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones away hence with you. Now, we have to remember, this was way back in Genesis now. We've had this oath, we had this statement made by Joseph, and we see Moses here honoring Joseph's oath and taking the bones of Joseph with him as the Israelites are leaving Egypt. Now, what did the long-awaited removal of the bones of Joseph from Egypt, what does this convey about God? Of course, it shows that he had been faithful to his people through the entirety of their sojourning in slavery there, that they had been put on them in Egypt, right? Carrying the embalmed Joseph out of Egypt showed that God is faithful to his word. God visited the Israelites just as Joseph had predicted that he would nearly 400 years earlier. Over in Genesis chapter 50, specifically verse 25, we won't flip over there, but Joseph makes the statement that God would, in fact, visit the Israelites and take care of them, and we see that now. So the long history of the faithfulness of God, as they watched Moses or Joseph's, maybe his mummy, whatever it was, whatever the case may be. Of course, the Egyptians were good at that. No matter how you brought him out, Joseph was a pretty important person during that time, so he could have been embalmed and mummified, or whatever they were doing to important people. Regardless, they knew where Joseph's tomb was or wherever he was laid to rest at. Seeing that being brought forth out of Egypt to the people of Israel should have encouraged the Israelites as they are beginning now to leave Egypt. Now, verses 20 down through 22, as we finish the chapter here, we see God being visually obvious in his leading Israelite in a specific way, and we'll also see why. Verse 20 down through verse 22, and they took their journey from Succoth and encamped in Etham in the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. And he took not away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night, from before the people. So they're finally leaving. God is leading them, and we see that during the day there's this tornado cloud, this pillar cloud, however you want to envision this huge cloud that reached, it's probably up, everybody could see it, and that was leading them in the direction they needed to go during the day. And then that cloud, that pillar cloud, turned into fire at night to help lead them, so they first of all could see, and then continue to see that as they're leading as well. So we see God being visually obvious on the direction that he wanted the people of Israel to go. And he made this grand display for them so that they would be reminded that he was with them, and they could be assured that wherever this cloud took them, he was leading them, right? He was the one in charge and leading them exactly to where he wanted them to be. And this is, I remember as a kid and stuff, and hearing the story in Sunday school and junior church and Awanas and different things, it was always one of those things, just like, this is really, really cool to see. But then as you kind of continue and kind of begin to look at this and read a little bit more about this thing, this cloud just didn't show up when they were traveling, right? It just didn't all at once appear, and then it was there all the time, okay? And then at night, they're setting up camp. It's dark, right, at night, and at some point there was a little 3-year-old that opened up mom and dad's tent and looked out and saw that pillar of fire out there in the distance, knowing and a reminder that God was in charge, he was in control, and he had them right where he wanted them to be. Moses, who probably was up somewhere near the beginning of that parade of people, as he was walking, probably felt the heat coming off that fire, and it was a reminder of him that God was in control, right? A reminder of him that all he had to do was follow the cloud. He didn't have to worry about these millions of people that were behind him. He technically wasn't in charge of them. God was, and that was there in leading them along. Can imagine passerbyers, right? Just other people traveling around that were maybe traveling from some other country into Egypt, and then coming up on this huge herd of people and seeing this giant cloud all the way to the ground, spinning around and leading this multitude of people through the desert, to different places. I'm sure it was a sight to see, and it's a pretty amazing idea that God came up with there to make sure that these people understood that he was in fact in control. Also, it meant that the Israelites, they weren't going to get lost, right? God's got the greatest sense of direction, has the absolute greatest sense of direction. He knew exactly where he was going, where he wanted to go, the roads he wanted to take, the detours he wanted to take, the pit stops he wanted to take. He knows all those things. He didn't need a GPS or anything to kind of help get him places. The cloud and pillar of fire were impossible to miss. The entire multitude would have been able to see these things at all times. God could not have been more obvious here in leading his people. He wanted them to know that he was directing the path at all times, and his presence never ever left them. God knew his people perfectly. He understood the lessons they needed to learn, and their greatest need after their deliverance from Egypt was to learn to trust him. Okay, so he wisely brought them to a place where they were forced to turn to him for help. So we see God leading Israel, first of all, with wisdom. Now down through verse 18 here of chapter 14, we're going to see God leading Israel with purpose. Okay? First 4 verses of chapter 14. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal-zephon, before it shall ye encamp by the sea. Excuse me. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, that they are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that he shall follow after them, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his hosts, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord, and they did so. So in relation to Israel here, God showed his wisdom in leading. In relation to Egypt, God shows his purpose in leading. Okay, and he discloses this purpose to Moses here in these first 4 verses, who then turns and tells the people of Israel. No one's in the dark, right? Nobody's uncertain or not been made sure of the purpose for God's leading where he led them. Now, God led his people to turn and camp between Migdol and the sea. Of course, trapped them in there so that God could receive glory, not just from the Israelites, but from Pharaoh and his army as well. Egypt was going, if they didn't already know Yahweh was real and alive and important, they were definitely going to know after the event that's getting ready to take place. Moses relates to the people that the Pharaoh would think that confused that they had become trapped by the Red Sea, right? So God's going to harden his heart again to come after the Israelites so that God could be finally victorious, totally victorious here over the Egyptians. And this was all part of this larger plan that God was using to reveal himself as Yahweh. As we saw in chapter 7, verses 15, 16, and 17. We saw in chapter 8, middle of the way through, I think verses 22, 23. God talks about specifically him being Yahweh. This is kind of the final lesson here, or another way in which God is going to reveal himself as Yahweh. Now, sounds like a great plan. And And apparently the Israelites obviously went right along with it as they followed God to the place where he was leading them. So Moses tells them God's going to lead us in between the wilderness and to trap us in between the wilderness and the sea. Pharaoh's going to think that we're confused because we've been there so long, and he's going to come after us. And God, this is all part of God's plan. And we see the Israelites here early on in this traversing being 100% on board with exactly what Moses was telling them. Of course, it would be hard not to with this huge pillar up there in front of us, but they were all on board and understood exactly what was going to take place. Now, God's plan here begins to fall in place when Pharaoh's men inform him that the people of Israel had indeed left and fled. Perhaps Pharaoh had given them maybe a prescribed path to take on their 3-day journey into the wilderness to worship God, and then they've deviated here from this path in some way. And when they've deviated from the path that he told them, this obviously would signal trouble here for Pharaoh. Go to verse 5 of chapter 14. And when it was told to the king of Egypt that the people fled, the heart of Pharaoh and of his servants was turned against the people, and they said, "Why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So they come in, and finally, all right, they're all gone. And then second thoughts, man, there goes our workforce. Now we're going to have to do this ourselves or capture somebody else. Why in the world would we let these people go? And pretty quickly forget what just took place there in Egypt, right? It was not many nights before, maybe even just the night before, that all these people had passed away, and the grief was so great you could hear all throughout the land. But we see that being forgotten very quickly when it comes to Pharaoh being more concerned with the power and the people he had control of. So we see verse 5 of him, why in the world do we do this? Verse 6, and he made ready his chariot, took his people with him. He took 600 chosen chariots and all the chariots of Egypt and captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and pursued after the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with a high hand. But the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them encamping by the sea beside Paharoth, before Baal Zephon. Okay, so verses 5 through 9. We see God hardening Pharaoh's heart again, and hardening it to the point where he pursues after the Israelites, and he is bound and determined to bring them back as slaves. The Israelites here would have been vital to Egypt's attempt to recover from the devastating plagues that just took place there in the land. So what Pharaoh does is he takes some of the chariots. Nope, he takes all of the chariots that he could immediately muster, which would have been several. He also takes, including the 600 best men that he has, and then takes off after the Israelites. And Israelites, this huge multitude of people walking very quickly. The Egyptians would have caught up to the Israelites who were there camping by the Red Sea. Now, the Israelites, as we're going to see in verses 10, 11, and 12 here, they think that they're trapped and they're doomed. They're either going to die or be taken slaves again. So we see them crying out to God. Verse 10, and when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. And they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord, and they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is it not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. 16 hours before, all right? Just 16 hours. If we were watching a video here, a movie, it jumped 16 hours before, right? The Israelites are totally on board with Moses and this plan, this huge pillar leading them in this place where the contract, but Moses is telling them, God's leading us here. He's told them he's going to bring the Egyptians in. They're going to act like they're going to enslave you again, but I'm going to take care of them. And all the Israelites are like, all right, God, sounds great. You brought us out of Egypt. We just witnessed 10 phenomenal supernatural plagues that only could have came from you. We've been following a pillar of smoke or of a cloud and the fire for a little while now. We're all on board. But as soon as the Egyptians show up, And now we jump back to the present day. And all the Israelites, oh no, Moses, why did you do this? Why did we follow you? Why did you bring us back? We would have been better off being slaves in Egypt than dying out here in the wilderness. How quickly we see the Israelites losing faith in God. But we also see the sovereignty of God and how earlier on we now know why God did not take them through the land of the Philistines. We now know why God put them in this situation, because he's having to show them and continue to teach them a lesson. So the Israelites think they're trapped and doomed, and they cry out to God. Now, this is not going to be the last time that the Israelites are going to accuse Moses of leading them out of Egypt to die. As a matter of fact, they do it so many times, it's hard to remember how many times they do it. What it does, though, is that it reveals each time that they still need to learn to trust God. Where was God when Israel cried out to him and then accused Moses of leading them astray? Where was God at while they're complaining to Moses? Where is God at right now? He's in a cloud, literally right in front of them. So as they're complaining to Moses, back behind this big, huge cloud swirling around that led them there, how quickly they forget. He was still in front of the Israelites in his position as their leader. His role did not change. The Israelites simply just didn't see a way to continue to follow him because there was something in front of them. The Red Sea was there. Even though God had specifically told them, he was leading them there to teach Egypt about his position as Yahweh. The Israelites so quickly acted like God had lost total control of the situation. The circumstances were just too great. He couldn't do anything about it at all. They let their limited understanding of the circumstances dictate whether they thought God was trustworthy or not. Moses, limited in his understanding of God's plan, told the people not to be afraid and to stand still and to see the salvation of the Lord. Go to verse 13. And Moses said to the people, "Fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace." So Moses shows even not the greatest understanding of this plan as well, but he does give them good advice. He tells them, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, except the standing still part, right, was not part of God's plan. The Lord was going to fight for Israel, but not as Moses thought that he was going to fight. The cloud still in front of the children of Israel was there for a reason. God expected the Israelites to follow him. Verse 15, and the Lord said unto Moses, "Wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward." So God speaks down to Moses, and why are you hollering at me for? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Moses here, and this is how my brain sees things. This is Lanciism. I can imagine Moses turning from the crowd and looking into the water and having a moment of, what in the world is he talking about? And then the cloud kind of begins to move, maybe even shakes a little bit over the water. I want you to go this way. Maybe it turns into an arrow and points like a cartoon. Go this way. Then you get to verse 16, but lift thou up thy rod and stretch out thine hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. So that big cloud arrow is pointing out over there. And Moses gets just instructions from God to lift out this staff that he has, the same one that he's been using now for all these different types of miracles that God has been doing before him. Lift the rod up and stretch it out over the sea, and it will divide. So the cloud moves out over onto the Red Sea, and Moses holds up his staff. After all, that is where the cloud is residing, over the Red Sea. It's saying, what are you waiting for? Follow me. God essentially was still leading them, even though they could not yet see the path along the floor of the Red Sea. In the face of threatening circumstances, we're going to stop right there because there's more things I want to talk about with this dividing of the Red Sea, and I don't have time today. But in the face of these threatening circumstances, Israel said, Moses, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die? In the face of threatening circumstances, Moses said, stand still and wait on God. See his salvation. In the face of threatening circumstances, God says, go forward. Guys, we've got threatening circumstances around us right now, right? Uncertain times, crazy things happening. We get people complaining about this and that and the other. The important thing for us to remember is that while we might not have a pillar of a cloud in front of us, or we might not even have that pillar of fire to show us exactly where to go, God's telling us one thing. Come to me. Go forward with me, closer to me. Maybe that big cartoon arrow is pointing right at God because our relationship needs to move forward. That's what the people of Israel had to do. As we get into next week, we're going to see even more. This dry land, fish swimming around these two things, all kinds of cool stuff happening. But it only happens when the Israelites took the step onto the ground, or when Moses held out the staff. God told Moses what to do. He had a decision to make. We see Moses following through on that, and then the results of it as well. Go forward. Don't stay still. Don't go back. Move closer to God. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson we had. Thank you for what we see here in this what you are giving and blessing the Israelites with through some uncertain circumstances, and how you are leading them in just the way you want them to go. Or the uncertainty that comes into our lives. I pray, Lord, that we don't look back to get where we were comfortable at. We don't just stop because we think it's okay, Lord, but we push through. Even through the fog and the haze sometimes, and maybe the weeds are really high. But the arrow is pointing forward, and we move forward with you, Lord, because we know, Lord, you're in control, you're leading, you're directing. Lord, and it's important for us to be faithful to you. I pray that is our desire. I pray that's our heart's content. I pray that is our heart's desire, Lord, to only be content when we're following you. Because that's where true contentment comes from. I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes here in the next few minutes, Lord. Just use him in a mighty way to keep us attentive to the words you have through him today as well. And I pray. Amen.